Hello class, this is Garrett Durham here with the History 820 online history lecture assignment. I want to begin by saying this is a graduate level class, this lecture tonight, a graduate level class that I designed for this course that has to do with U.S. and Cuban relations, or just really Cuban history of the 20th century as well. It could be either one of those classes, kind of a Latin American studies class, as it has to do with American history and foreign policy and things of that nature. It also has a lot to do with military and intelligence history, of course, that is intertwined with diplomatic, political history as well. The title of my lecture tonight is Operation Zapata, the Bay of Pigs invasion and its consequences, 1961. As I said, this is going to deal with a lot of history as far as, of course, militarily and intelligence-wise, and a lot of political. First though, we have to deal with a little bit of background. The Bay of Pigs invasion is a very complicated kind of situation when you look at it. Bay of Pigs invasion is commonly known among public knowledge. It's not something that you have to have a degree in history to know about. A lot of people know the Bay of Pigs was a epic failure as far as American might is concerned, or American strategy is concerned. They may not know much more beyond that. But tonight I want to talk about more beyond that. I want to discuss the Bay of Pigs, but first discussing that, I want to discuss the background, because you can't understand the Bay of Pigs without really understanding why that occurred. The Bay of Pigs originated from what came out of Cuba is after the Castro regime took over Cuba in 1959 from the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, who was the leader of Cuba in the 50s. And like I said, a man named Fidel Castro began organized a coup and eventually led an uprising. It began in, I think, 1953 or so, where Castro and several of his followers that he had recruited out of Mexico and other places staged an attacked the Moncada barracks in Cuba, Cuban army barracks, and he was arrested among a lot of his followers, and he was put in prison and sent back to Mexico. He spent time in the U.S. And he came back, and he organized a new following. He gained a lot more followers. He became more popular, and then eventually became known as the July 26th movement, which came out of the July 26, 1953 barracks attack. So they took that name and ran with it, and he made his way back to Cuba in the mid to late 50s with quite a few followers, started an uprising, and eventually took Cuba back, essentially on New Year's Day, 1959. Fulgencio Batista fled the country. Castro takes power, becomes the essential leader of Cuba. And what all this means to the U.S. is tricky, because the U.S. really, obviously they don't want, this is the time of the late 50s, early 60s. We don't want another communist influence in the world, especially 90 miles from our southernmost tip of Florida, the southernmost tip of Florida. So we were eager to uproot this power, whether we wanted to admit it publicly or not. But inside the halls of the White House, definitely, President Dwight Eisenhower, who was Allied commander, of the Supreme Allied Commander of the forces in World War II, obviously he knows what he wants here. He wants a complete overthrow of the Castro regime to prevent any kind of communist influence in the West. During the transition period after Kennedy's elected in 1960, really there was two main big points that Eisenhower wanted to wanted Kennedy to understand, and those were big, and they were both to do with communist influences in the world that he thought that would spread over west, and that was in Laos, which is a completely another subject, which will lead to Vietnam and all that kind of stuff. But he thought Laos and Cuba were the biggest issues in the world at that time, so he tells Kennedy this. Kennedy runs with it, and you have to understand communist influence. I had a professor in grad school that always said, "Don't you remember Munich?" Quoting LBJ, and he would do LBJ's voice regarding Hitler in the Munich conference. If you if you give them a little, they'll take a lot, type of thing. And you have to understand that to understand what we'll come to talk about in the Bay of Pigs. So we had to do something. We felt that we had to do something really close to this communist power that was uprising. Castro not really even calling himself a communist yet. We could see the signs, and his upcoming partnership with the Soviets, after we kind of snubbed them, was in perspective. So we kind of understood that he may go that direction. So we wanted to nip it in the bud when we could. So secret operation was called Operation Zapata, was put into place by Eisenhower and essentially handed over or dumped to President Kennedy. And a lot of the reasons for this could be because President Kennedy, of course, was a lieutenant in World War II. Obviously, Ike was a 5-star general, so that could be part of it, I believe. And this is a good plan, and President Kennedy just agreed. And I don't think anyone in President Kennedy's circle really had much to say different than that. I don't think, another matter. But so the actual invasion itself, it's set in motion. The wheels are turning in the early months of Kennedy's presidency. Training is being conducted before Kennedy's presidency in Guatemala. Completely CIA funded and trained, recruited Cuban exiles who wanted to take back their country, but the CIA completely recruits these people around Miami, Florida, out of Cuba, everything else. They train them, they support them, all in Guatemala. Guatemala, the government was completely fine with this. It was a well-known thing. You can't really hide this type of big operation. So the CIA funds this group that would become known as Brigade 2506, and a little bit of piece of the intelligence history here. Brigade 2506 sounded like a big army. It sounded like 2,500 people or soldiers in this Cuban exile army, but obviously it wasn't. It was only about 1,500 at the most. 2506, that number actually came from a man whose number, I think it started at 2,500, the brigade did, and it numbered from there. Number 2506 was the first man to have died during the training, so they named it after him. Well, Brigade 2506 hits the beaches, and we're talking I think 1,400 paramilitaries divided into 5 infantry battalions, 1 paratrooper battalion, and they stormed the beaches in the dark, known as Playa Harlon, or the Bay of Pigs, translated the Bay of Pigs. This is in the dark, invading an island, an amphibious landing. We should know from World War II that this is it's not practical. You have to do this in the light. You have to know where you're going. Many challenges were faced, such as the coral and the landing site for the beaches have been changed many times, and this final resting place here at the Bay of Pigs wasn't a good decision due to the coral and the physical landscape of the beaches. There's a lot in the way. It was shark infested. It just wasn't good to land there, and especially in the dark. So that's another big challenge. The Cuban Army sees it's coming. The Miami Herald actually posted something because they had spies everywhere. The Miami Herald, which is the newspaper in Miami, actually posted something how the CIA was training Cuban exiles for an invasion force into Cuba just a few days before it actually started. So that's a red flag as well. And Grayson Lynch, Decision for Disaster, I'll talk about him just for a second, in just a minute, about how he was a CIA officer, and he was actually the first one on the beaches that morning or that night when told no Americans should be on the beaches. Plausible deniability, we should keep that, make sure we're not involved directly. But air support was promised. Kennedy finally gave the green light on this operation. Of course, at the very end, it was yes and no, push and shove until the very last minute. Air support was promised. I think about 16 airstrikes, scheduled airstrikes. It was cut down to 8, so in half toward the last moment. Cuban exiles did not know, so they stormed the beaches thinking they're going to have all this air support, as well as maybe the Marines staging off a boat, off carriers in the sea, which they were. But they thought that they would come in at the last moment to kind of save them. Of course, that doesn't happen. The mission was a disaster. Was a disaster. The Cubans obviously felt betrayed at this. Here's a picture of the Cubans training in Guatemala, doing parachute drop practice. So you can see at the bottom there, they had to practice from a very low range because they risked getting shot down before they could get down. So you had to jump at a low range. Same with the flights at the low ranging there, trying to control the beaches. You have to control the air to control the beach. And then this is one of the planes that was actually disguised as a Cuban defecting plane that actually attacked Cuban airports a day or two before the actual invasion, and was a CIA operation, obviously part of it, to take out their Air Force, some of their Air Force. But obviously this doesn't, it wasn't actually a Cuban defector, it was a CIA, Cuban exile worker for CIA, but it preluded the invasion. And this is Grayson Lynch. He was a CIA officer, first one on the dark beaches that night, or early morning. He was a D-Day vet, Battle of Bulge vet. All that's very impressive. If that's not impressive enough, he goes on to do all this, works and does like over 100 raids after the Bay of Pigs, and then it's 7 years on Cuba with Cuban exiles as part of a secret operation out of Miami, CIA. Consequences, there's a lot of consequences of the Bay of Pigs. I think the most controversial one, I would say, right now, after that, Cubans lost all focus and all hope in Kennedy and Democrats. And to this day, a lot of Cubans will refuse to vote for a Democrat to do with the Bay of Pigs. And I don't know. The question remains, is Cuba really important now? Are they an intelligence threat? Are they a military threat? That's kind of up in the air. I don't really know. You can decide or argue either way. But yeah, it has ruined this Bay of Pigs and the U.S.-Cuban relations. A lot of the seeds that were planted during the Bay of Pigs and the Cold War in this era, we're still reaping that right now. We're definitely reaping what we sowed on both sides. And their influence has been felt, and the influence and the legacy of the Bay of Pigs has definitely been felt. Here's some further reading. All these books I would recommend. They're fantastic. But thank you so much, and thank you for listening.